Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, was compelled to acknowledge that their country is losing the battle in Ukraine. Putin is at a loss for what to do after getting into difficulties with the Russian oligarchs. The Russian oligarchs who disagree with Vladimir Putin are putting plans in place to get rid of him. All of the Russian oligarchs' backing for Vladimir Putin has ended shortly after the Russian oligarchs withdrew their backing. Putin found himself in a very precarious position when he acknowledged that the war in Ukraine was winning by quickly dissipating all of Russia's valuable assets. The Russian oligarchs that arose as soon as the Soviet Union fell quickly started to enrich themselves. The state no longer has any control over any of the key sources of income, including the mines and factories that produce precious metals, natural gas reserves, and oil. Vladimir Putin engaged in a protracted battle with the Russian billionaires before conquering Ukrainian territory as a result. Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, took measures to destroy all oligarchs who opposed the Russian army and the apostasy of occupation. Following Russia's invasion of Ukrainian territory, they made significant statistics about numerous Russian oligarchs, caused all of the arrows to point in Putin's direction. It was even more strange that these Russian oligarchs, who were well-known figures in business, were killed because they opposed Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Although Putin has so far been successful in carrying out this strategy, it is rumored that his major objective is to seize control of the natural gas and oil resources held by Russian billionaires and to more easily rule over Western nations. The Russian oligarchs who support Vladimir Putin have suffered billions of dollars in losses as a result of the recent losses of the Russian army in Ukraine and the turbulent era of the Russian economy. Now that these Russian millionaires have admitted to backing Vladimir Putin, the Russian army in Ukraine is in a very precarious position. The Russian oligarchs have revealed their support for Vladimir Putin with this concurrent move. Vladimir Putin has never before acknowledged that they are losing the battle in Ukraine. The Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, added that if the conflict continued in this manner, it might be necessary to remove the Russian forces. The Russian economy, which had been operating smoothly during the early stages of the conflict, experienced severe difficulties in the midst of the conflict, along with the sanctions put in place against Russia by the US and other Western nations. Corruption that started to emerge as a result of theft by Russian oligarchs made Vladimir Putin's work much harder. But Putin remained mute because he understood that in order to maintain his occupation of Ukraine, he needed the backing of the Russian billionaires. However, as the war went on and the Russian army started to lose the fight in Ukraine, Russian oligarchs Konstantin Malafeev and Alexei Mordashov, who are well known to be close supporters of Vladimir Putin, declared losses of more than $95 billion. The first business person to decide to stop backing Vladimir Putin has done so. Vladimir Putin is already known to have spent down more than half of the Russian army's stockpile and 70% of the national coffers. Vladimir Putin, on the other hand, was receiving cash from the Russian billionaires as a result of his loss of access to the public coffers. The Russian forces fighting in Ukraine will soon be without arms and ammunition after the Russian oligarchs cut off their assistance. Vladimir Putin, who acted on the oligarchs' decision, began to charge the oligarchs with defrauding the Russian government of $18 billion. Putin asked that these oligarchs be convicted and imprisoned. In addition to starting a battle against them after discovering their support for the Russian government, Russians reacted most strongly to these conflicts between Vladimir Putin and the country's oligarchs. Russian citizens began protesting against Vladimir Putin in the streets of Moscow. According to Russian residents, Putin is aware that oligarchs in their country have been scamming the government for a long time, but the government has refrained from taking action because of the support that these oligarchs have given to the Russian army in several Russian cities. Citizens who were furious about the situation rushed to the streets to call for the punishment of these billionaires. But rioting quickly followed these demonstrations. These demonstrations in a precarious position. Vladimir Putin acknowledged for the first time that the war in Ukraine was costing them. Putin stated in his Victory Day address that Russia's future depended on the conflict in Ukraine and that they are beginning to lose the battle in an effort to quell the crowds who had begun to demonstrate in the streets. Putin made an effort to quell the protests and the Russian people with his address. The globe as a whole is shocked that the Russian oligarchs made such a move. As you are aware, since the start of the war, more than 10 Russian oligarchs have perished in Russia. Many questions are raised by the Russian oligarchs' decision to discontinue their support for Vladimir Putin. As you are aware, given the start of the war, it is unlikely that the US and other Western nations are responsible for the Russian oligarchs' abrupt decision to stop supporting Putin. The assets of Russian billionaires with businesses in Russia, Europe, and America were taken by the US and other Western nations when their assets worth billions of dollars were seized. Russian oligarchs turned to Vladimir Putin for assistance. Putin, on the other hand, did nothing as time went on. In addition, Russian oligarchs who supported the Russian army and were unable to access their assets in Europe started to distance themselves from Vladimir Putin. They would not have had to support the Russian army, and they would have had the option to save their assets in the US and other Western nations. The question at hand is whether these Russian oligarchs would survive after abandoning their support for Putin. One of the main causes of this is the suspicious figures of more than 10 Russian oligarchs. The Russian people have suffered as a result of the occupation of Ukrainian territory. Russian residents were unaware of this throughout the early stages of the war and went about their normal lives as usual. The Russian economy, however, was in a very bad position as a result of the sanctions that the US and other Western nations later imposed on Russia, as well as the money spent to pay the Russian army to prolong the war in Ukrainian land. An economic crisis hit the Russian economy also had a terrible impact on Russian citizens. Russian citizens have been enrolled in the census as a result of the sharp rises in the cost of food and technology, as well as growing inflation rates. Even pro-Putin citizens who backed him during the first month of the conflict now oppose it. Vladimir Putin, however, is adamant about continuing this invasion of Ukrainian territory at the expense of his own people. The Russian people have frequently flocked to the streets to demonstrate against Putin and the conflict, but Vladimir Putin has always responded in the same way, has used Russian security forces to put an end to these protests. During the protests held just in the first few months of the war, Russian authorities jailed tens of thousands of residents. Additionally, thousands of Russian citizens were jailed for their anti-Vladimir Putin protests. The Russian people's resentment of Vladimir Putin is growing due to his aggressive actions in both domestic and foreign affairs. Putin is also attempting to conceal from his own people the losses suffered by the Russian army on Ukrainian soil by repeatedly refusing to divulge them and claiming that they are a state secret. Putin not only declines to release this information directly, but he also restricts access to the websites that do so. As you are already aware, Russian media cannot publish this information. Putin previously brought charges against a Russian journalist who organized a live anti-war protest. The Russian army is exhausting the list of servicemen and their families who say they will not fight because victory can only be attained through faith. An army composed of troops who do not desire to fight and do not believe in victory cannot succeed. The Russian army is one of the biggest armies in the world in terms of the total number of men, with estimates putting its serf personnel at above 3 million. However, it is now obvious that an army's strength cannot be determined solely by the number of soldiers present after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. 10 troops that are committed to winning and have a strong sense of purpose are more powerful than 100 unmotivated warriors. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, did not have the backing of the Russian people when he started his invasion of Ukraine. Putin consequently encountered numerous issues within the army throughout the conflict. Most Russian soldiers were reluctant to join the invasion of Ukraine. Young people who were old enough for military service organized rallies to prevent enlisting because they believed this conflict to be pointless. Military recruiting offices were burned down. Despite all of this, Putin persisted in occupying Ukraine. Russian soldiers are laying down their weapons as a result of Putin's steadfast refusal to end the occupation. The number of Russian soldiers fleeing the front lines has been rising consistently since the start of the takeover of Ukraine, so much so that in September 2022, Putin accepted the truth of the matter and issued a partial mobilization due to the fact that Russian soldiers either opted to surrender to Ukrainian forces or quit the front lines as a result of the war's failure. This mobilization announcement was unable to make up for the lack of military personnel in the Russian army. The accounts of Russian troops who claimed to be stormtroopers have recently gained a lot of attention on social media. About 20 Russian troops proclaimed their reluctance to combat and described the issues with the Russian army through a spokesperson. They chose among themselves because of the soldiers' troubles and losses, which were getting worse every day. The spokesperson soldier in the film, who was pointing at roughly 20 soldiers, said that we had 150 individuals when we first arrived at the ZMO, particularly the military operating zone. This is all that is left of us after vicious battles. Russian soldiers made startling statements in the footage that was shared. They complained that the army did not give them enough food, liquids, or compensation. The soldiers have continually demonstrated the inferiority of the Russian army with the recordings they have produced since the commencement of the invasion of Ukraine, despite the fact that the Russian authorities suppress this reality. With the help of this film, the weariness of the Russian army was brought to light once more because the speaker troops disclosed a serious issue that the army faces in addition to food and immediate needs. The Russian soldiers summed up the state of the army in this statement as follows: the injured weren't taken away. The corpses are still decaying. There are terrible directives that should not be followed. We truly think that we are being merely annulled. 3 months have passed while we have received no compensation. These words make it quite evident that the Russian military does not regard its troops. According to the spokesman in the video, they were told to travel to the Zaporizhzhia region settlement of Prionini. One of the locations where there have been the most conflicts recently is the Zaporizhzhia region. The Ukrainian army is believed to have started the spring operation from this area. According to my theory, the Russian soldiers' spokesperson eventually stated that their recommenders had refused their orders and that they would not be traveling to the area to the military police. We submit it wouldn't be on the zero line. If any of us passed away here, it would imply that we were not killed in battle, but rather by one of our own Russian families whose husbands, brothers, kids and friends are serving in the military are concerned about these issues in the Russian army. Russian families do not want their loved ones to pass away as a result of Putin's desire. They frequently issue comments calling for an end to the occupation of Ukraine. Because of this, the testimonials of the Russian families were recently included in a study written by a war research group with headquarters in Washington. The Russian army, according to the families, failed to support their soldiers. The report's assertion that the so-called Kakhovka Dam had been destroyed was another noteworthy one. In order to halt the progress of the Ukrainian army, Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam last month. Putin's actions demonstrated the Russian army's desperation. The issues that emerged following the demolition of the Kakhovka Dam were the subject of a relative of the Russian soldiers. The wife of a soldier claimed her husband had lost everything. She clarifies that her husband and other Russian soldiers were involved in the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, lacked artillery, supports, earths, radios, clothing, and radios. She claimed that once the dam burst, soldiers in the area were moved in a different direction and dispatched right away to the front lines of battle without any rest. On social media, the uprising of Russian families has also taken center stage. There are many accounts on social media that share content related to the war in Ukraine, Russia, and other related topics. A Russian woman claimed that the Russian army abandoned her relatives who were fighting overseas. The woman claimed that because the soldiers lacked the necessary gear, they were sent to the front lines. She claimed that there was no possibility for the soldiers on the front lines to flee in order to seek medical attention or assistance. Following the Wagner uprising, the issues facing the Russian army become more apparent. Undoubtedly, the Wagner Group uprising gave the Ukrainian army a chance to advance, but it also sped things up. The Russian army's weariness was severe. I observed that the retreat of Wagner Group soldiers who had been stationed in places like Bakhmut and Soledar, where the war's most intense confrontations had occurred, had a negative impact on the Russian army as well. In actuality, the Wagner Group's exit from the conflict caused the Russian front to lose over 50,000 soldiers. The Wagner Group declared that as of July 1st, it would lay down its arms down. But numerous questions emerged in the mind after this statement. Due to the fact that the Wagner force was made up of mercenaries, it was almost guaranteed that David might rejoin the fight if the soldiers Hoover claimed to have laid down their weapons received overpayments in Wagner that exceeded their salaries. According to Dr. Colin Alexander, a lecturer at the University of Nottingham, a person or group might theoretically use these techniques to rearm surrendered Wagner soldiers in Britain. However, the fundamental idea of being a mercenary army is that you are a gun for sale. Wagner has claimed that it is philosophically loyal to Russia and Russian goals. The idea of a mercenary is that you are not especially ideological. Therefore, if another paying client approaches us and requests that you fight for them, that is not a mercenary. As a qualified surgeon, you struggle for a weight. Therefore, it is impossible for Wagner to change depending on who pays them. In contrast to the Ukrainian army, which was receiving military assistance from Western and European nations, the Russian army was suffering significant defeats. Additionally, the rebellion of the Wagner organizations was detrimental to Russia's future. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, is having a hard time keeping up with both domestic backlash and frontline assaults. The end of Putin's authority is what the Russian people perceive as the solution. Do you think the Russian army will be able to make up for the new Asian and the lack of military personnel? Will Putin be able to stop the uprising in several Russian regions following the Wagner Group uprising? What do you think about the Ukrainian army's decisive breakthrough against the Russian army, which is getting smaller every day? Your opinions are intriguing to us. Some cities, places, or regions are more crucial than others during a war. There were several good strategic locations in these cities. An army can obtain a significant advantage over its adversaries during both defense and attack by dominating these cities. Such cities abound amid the continuing conflict between Russia and Ukraine on the coast of the Sea of Azov. One of these cities is Berdyansk. The city is of inestimable value to both nations. Looking at the latest developments, we can tell that the Ukrainian army has advanced its plan to enter this city. The changes taking place in and around Berdyansk support this. Consequently, what is going on in Berdyansk and why is the city significant? Let's look at the most recent reports and developments on the city's significance to ensure that you don't miss our in-depth map analysis and daily reporting on the Russia-Ukraine border. Subscribe to our channel and enable notifications. Additionally, you may assist our group by clicking the Super Thanks button. According to the Pioneer, practically the entire front line is still experiencing the Ukrainian army's counter-onslaught, which has slowed down. Several sources claim that the Ukrainian forces are taking the initiative at several spots along the battlefield. The reports cover more than just the front lines, though. The attacks of the Ukrainian troops behind the front line have also undergone notable changes. The harbor city of Berdyansk is one of the crucial locations behind the front line that the Ukrainian army have been attacking recently and even for a considerable amount of time. So much so that Berdyansk appears to have taken precedence on the Ukrainian army's recent list of regions to capture. The city on the western shore of the Sea of Azov is frequently shelled by Ukrainian troops using heavy weapons. The airfield in Berdyansk has recently come under intense attack by Ukrainian artillery, utilizing a huge quantity of Storm Shadow missiles. Local sources suggest that numerous missiles successfully struck their targets without being intercepted by air defense systems, contrary to claims made by Russian sources that the Storm Shadow missiles fired by the Ukrainian army were destroyed by the air defense systems. The events that followed the missile attack also appeared to contradict the Russian sources' assertions. Numerous Russian helicopters are stationed at the airport, according to information that was brought in from the area immediately following the missile assault. The airport was left. According to reports, the Russian helicopters that flew away from the region never came back. It is impossible to say that these helicopters took off for an operational activity in this situation. According to reports, the helicopters were moved to a different area because of security issues. The action in Berdyansk continued after this incident. The newest missile assaults on the Berdyansk were also the subject of declarations and a report by the Ukrainian Armed Forces. The report provided by the Ukrainian Armed Forces has one very startling piece of information, though. The article claims that Iranian airport was not the only target of Ukrainian shelling, along with the attacks near the airport. Ukrainian artillery reportedly destroyed a Russian and modern Asian depot on a significant military installation nearby. Regarding the Russian casualties in the area, Russia has not yet released a comment. May 1st say that the city is currently engulfed in a severe pandemonium. Nearly a dozen missile assaults against Russian helicopters, mutation depots, and supply routes in the city occur in a single day. Even in one day, the noises of explosions and ambulance sirens never stop. According to the concept of continuity, Russia is currently losing the battle even behind the front lines in Berdyansk. The Russian military is allegedly getting ready to implement fresh measures in Berdyansk. Hanna Maliar, a spokesperson for the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, recently stated that the Ukrainian army were quite near to Berdyansk near the Ukrainian troop strikes on Berdyansk behind the front line, and the developments on the front line both appear to have greatly alarmed the Russian occupation forces. The Russian army has reportedly started constructing a minefield around the city. According to the most recent sources, the Ukrainian troops' advance on the front line, according to the Russian army, will be stopped by this. However, even the missile assaults from the Ukrainian army are sufficient to cause the Russian army to suffer casualties. As a result, few experts believe that the Russian army's action will benefit Russia in any way. So why are both armies so adamant in capturing Berdyansk city on the shore of the Sea of Azov in the easternmost region of Ukraine is where you'll find the city of Berdyansk. The Azov Sea became Russia's internal sea after the Russian army took control of the area. As a result, the Russian naval forces' performance in the Sea of Azov was fairly impressive. The city of Berdyansk, which is also rather close to the Russian mainland, is on one of the shortest routes to transfer anything the Russian occupation soldiers on the front line need, including ammunition, food, and other supplies. The Russian army frequently deploys its troops through Berdyansk, particularly in Crimea. The supply lines are one of the crucial elements that allow the Russian occupation forces to quickly transfer these certifications to the front line. Numerous highway and railway routes connect Berdyansk to every portion of Ukraine in the area. With these lines, the Russian army is able to easily support its frontline soldiers. Berdyansk are seen by the Ukrainian army as a crucial threshold to cut off these augmentations of the Russian forces on the front lines. As a result, any missile attack by Ukraine in the area results in significant casualties for Russia. When attacking the city, the Ukrainian army not only destroys supply lines, roadways, and railway lines in the city, preventing any aid from reaching the Russian troops on the front lines, but it also targets the Russian occupation forces' headquarters and pay depots in order to stop further Russian reinforcements. The Ukrainian army frequently target the Berdy ports where the Russian reinforcements stopped before entering Ukrainian territory. In this way, the occupying forces stationed in the city of Berdyansk, as well as the Russian soldiers on the front lines, coexist with the Ukrainian army in a difficult situation. The Ukrainian army is exerting a lot more pressure on the area. According to the most recent reports, the operations on the front line are heavily influenced by the missile attack, demonstrating the supremacy of the Ukrainian army behind the front line. The Ukrainian army has made the most progress in the direction of the Berdyansk since they began their counteroffensive. The Russian army is in an extremely challenging situation on the southern front line, as seen by the Ukrainian army's offensive on the Berdyansk as well as those on Melitopol and Tokmak. How do you feel? Will the Ukrainian army be able to push toward Berdyansk in your opinion? Will Berdyansk's seizure by the Ukrainian army change the course of the conflict? Is it possible to infer that the assaults on Berdyansk, Mariupol, Melitopol and Tokmak are to blame for the Russian frontline soldiers' incapacity to fend off the Ukrainian offensive? Do you believe that Berdyansk is a feasible target for the Ukrainian army? What is the state of the local Russian military? We respect your opinions. The future of the world has been determined for ages by blood and gunpowder in every century. These two components originated in various ways and from various geographical locations. While some countries took this as a lesson and learned from it, others did not follow suit and only wanted to smell the blood and gunpowder. The conflict that the Russian leader began reeked of gunpowder and blood. Putin could not anticipate that the scent of blood and gunpowder would permeate in a way that adversely altered Russia's future. Many areas of the region are experiencing a ferocious upsurge in the battle. The Russian army is facing more and more challenges as a result of the Ukrainian army's continued victories. Moreover, the upcoming Ukrainian invasion is putting more psychological pressure on the Russian troops. The recent sightings of Ukrainian drones over Moscow, photos of several Ukrainian soldiers injured in the Belgorod Oblast, which occurred in the northern part of Ukraine but was within Russian territory, and the frequent explosions and fires in Russia are all contributing to the psychological strain. Many local sources assert that there is a big panic in the Kremlin, despite the fact that Russian decision-makers have not made any recent pronouncements concerning the current situation. What is the most recent state of affairs on the front lines? What places Russian officers in such a challenging circumstance? Let's use a map to examine the most recent developments. We want to remind you of a few things before we discuss the most recent developments to bring you the most recent information on the conflict in Russia and Ukraine. The Pioneer and its team have been working non-stop to continue with this hard work. We need your help by clicking the Super Thanks button below the video. You can help us out. We need to state the following. First, the most recent developments have once again supported our theories regarding the southern wing of the Ukrainian onslaught, which we have frequently emphasized in earlier publications. The Ukrainian 37th Marine Brigade and Carlson have started to actively use the Dnipro River, which is one of the two most crucial places. When we consider the south of Ukraine and the east of the river are set to see huge events. American APQ's missiles have a maximum range of 11 kilometers. We can see from Kherson's center that Ukrainian soldiers have complete firing access to the P-57 roadway on the river's eastern bank. The Ukrainian army has been pelting the P-57 highway and its surroundings with these missiles in recent days. These missiles, which are assisted by a laser guidance package, produce extremely effective outcomes. The Ukrainian army's gains on the southern front are compelling the Russian army to take action there. As you are aware, Russian occupation forces are in charge of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power facility. Every time this nuclear power plant operates, Russia poses a threat to the entire world. However, due to the Ukrainian army's supremacy in the area, Russia is worried that it would lose control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power facility east of the Dnipro River. On the other side of Nikopol is where you'll find the Zaporizhzhia NPP. The Ukrainian army's advancements and its east of the river offensive present a serious threat to the occupied eastern territory. As a result, we are aware that the Russian army is putting together a robust defense in the area. Local reports claim that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station has recently received a significant quantity of cargo. Russia has been compelled to defend itself here, as well as in many other locations, demonstrating Ukraine's resistance in the area. Let's now examine the war's critical front lines. Naturally, the backward line is our main concern. While discussing the conflict score, the Wagner, Malaysia, and Bakhmut are receiving a lot of artillery fire from Ukraine. The 93rd Mechanized Brigade of Ukraine is heavily shelling. The Wagner militia has established positions in the industrial zone while going into off-back mode. Wagner militias in the area are attempting to blend in by utilizing residential structures. These points are discovered nonetheless, thanks to the effective activity of Ukrainian intelligence. Ukrainian artillery detonated a structure in the industrial area that the Wagner militia had used as a base. We may claim that Luhansk will be on the line that opens the northern front. Therefore, Luhansk is crucial for attacking purposes. The breakthrough line that will be opened from the back much will travel to Luhansk. As we can see on the map, the Ukrainian army is exerting significant pressure on the Russian army's weaponry as part of the offensive preparations. The 25th Suggestal Airborne Brigade carried out a number of actions in Luhansk during this time since the start of the conflict. Ukrainian actions have obliterated a large number of Russian armored vehicles. The brigade specifically targeted Russian armored vehicles in Luhansk and a convoy of BMP-style armored vehicles. 2 Russian BMPs were obliterated. That's from Luhansk, Wilyana. These vehicles, according to estimates, were intended to assist the Russian forces at Bakhmut. On the other hand, 2 M6MP-type Russian armored infantry vehicles, which are infrequently seen in battle or among the vehicles destroyed in the area. Russian soldiers continue to sustain severe losses and donuts. Russian media channels claim that the Ukrainian Air Force is functioning admirably against Russia. The Russian press is likewise interested in the advantage offered by Ukrainian drones. The Russian army has placed several troops in Donetsk as seen on the map. There are a significant number of Russian armored units in this area, which is one of the front line's focal points in this location. Russian armored formations are also being attacked by the Ukrainian Air Force. Recently, a number of missions in this area have been carried out by Ukrainian drones as part of their plan to weaken Russia's weaponry. An FPS-27 detonated one Russian tank during the actions in the area. Regarding the thermobaric grenade shot by a Ukrainian drone, Russia has suffered vehicle losses off the battlefield as well. Recently, a scandalous event happened in Moscow, the capital of Russia. The armored vehicles in the ministry convoy of Russian soldiers heading to the battlefield were struck by a truck. According to estimates, the military convoy that left Moscow was en route to Belgorod outlast a gathering to which the Russian public is afraid to be invited. According to local sources, the disaster caused numerous deaths among the Russian soldiers in the convoy and significant damage to numerous Russian armored vehicles. Moscow is not the only city in Russia affected by the events that have shook the nation. Recently, we discussed the explosion that occurred at the military airport in St. Petersburg, located in the country's north. It wasn't just one explosion. A big explosion or even an abandoned thermal power plant that occurred in St. Petersburg. Initial examinations indicate that the explosion only caused material damage. The reports do contain one extremely interesting element, though. Many strategists and military analysts believe that the explosion was triggered by an improvised explosive device as the Ukrainian army's advance draws near. This explosion is an attempt to divert Russia's attention. No area of Russia will therefore be secure until the Russian army has totally left Ukraine.